Hey, I'm Dr. Juan Valdes with Reasons for Hope, and today I want to talk to you about God's existence. Let's lay out the case for God's existence today, and let's see if there's a good case to be made for God as a necessary being. Now, when we talk about God's existence, typically there's a lot of arguments, but there's typically three arguments that are very common, and those are the ones I want to share with you today. First of all, we have the Cosmological Argument, which really is the argument from creation. Comes from the word cosmos, which means creation. The argument from creation for the existence of God. The second one is the Axiological Argument. In other words, the argument from moral law. Axios means judgment. So it's the argument for God's existence from moral law. And the third one I want to do with you is the Teleological Argument. And that's the argument from design. Teleos, speaking of purpose or design. So these three arguments, although they're not the only arguments out there, are very strong arguments. And when they are considered seriously, they point to God's existence. Any one of the arguments is very powerful. But when you combine the three of them, the case for God is beyond any reasonable doubt. So let's start with the argument from creation. By the way, these are also phrased in very easy to remember, and I encourage you to memorize these syllogisms. There's two premises and a conclusion. So the argument from creation goes something like this. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. That's premise one. Premise two, the universe began to exist. Conclusion, therefore the universe has a cause. These are what we call deductive arguments. And a deductive argument is a very powerful way to present an argument, because if the premises are true, then the conclusion has to follow. The conclusion must be true. And so when we talk about the universe beginning to exist, and that everything that begins to exist requires a cause, we're establishing a very strong argument for God's existence based on the law of causality, which is well-established law in science. Every effect has a cause. The universe is an effect if it began to exist. So the universe needs a cause. So let's first consider how people attempt to respond to this. Here's three attempts to refute the argument. Some people will say, well, the universe did not begin to exist. The universe is eternal. And others will say, well, the universe did begin to exist, but it came from nothing. It doesn't have a cause. And there's finally those in the line of David Hume, the skeptic, who said that the argument doesn't point to any particular deity or agent. That one we don't even have to address, because it's not the point of the argument to identify who the God or creator or agent is. The point of the argument is simply to establish that a creator is a necessary being, given that the earth and the universe began to exist. So it's not the point of the argument, it's to establish the identity of the agent or the creator. That would be the equivalent of saying, well, the argument fails because it fails to tell us how to celebrate the 4th of July. It's not supposed to tell us how to celebrate the 4th of July. That's the category of attack that is. So we're not even going to address that. Let's address the first two, because they are serious attacks. Is the universe eternal? Now let's look at some scientific facts here. The view of an eternal universe, eternal matter, is known as the steady state theory. It is a theory that basically postulates that the universe is constantly producing hydrogen from nothing. Otherwise, it could not be eternal. It is a theory that has fallen in disgrace. It no longer really is sustained by any cosmologist or reputable academic institution as an explanation for the universe we live in. The consensus of scientists today that study the origins of the universe is that the universe began to exist in the finite past. More specifically, time, space, matter, and energy all began to exist at the same moment in the finite past. That's what science today confirms. The main evidence for the universe having a beginning is the second law of thermodynamics, which says that the universe is running out of usable energy. Think about it. If the universe is running out of usable energy, then it cannot be eternal. What has been winding down must have been wound up. And that's not the only line of evidence. Modern cosmology in the hands of Hubble and Einstein and Hawking have all, given us amazing reasons to believe that the universe had a beginning. From Einstein's theory of relativity to the discovery of background radiation with the Hubble telescope and other arguments that are presented. So in the world of science, the idea of matter being eternal is no longer a thing. It's pretty much accepted across the board, even by those who are non-believers, even by atheists, that the universe had a beginning. And there's even a philosophical reason why it had to have a beginning. Other than a scientific reason, here's a philosophical reason to believe that the world had a starting point. This argument shows that time cannot go back into the past forever. Now, this requires a little bit of thinking here. It is impossible to pass through an infinite series of moments. What do I mean by that? If the past is infinite, then we could never have passed through the time to get to today. Today is a specific point imagine a number line. Today is a specific point in that number line. But if there's no beginning, you can never get to this point. You can only get to the point we are today if there is a beginning. If the world never had a beginning, then we could not have reached today. Philosophers have known that for a long time. But we have reached today. So time must have begun at a particular point in the past, and today has come as a definite time since then. It's what we call in philosophy the need for an uncaused cause that brought everything into existence. Otherwise, we would find ourselves in an infinite regress. You go back, looking for that starting point, you never find it, so you can never arrive at where we are today. Therefore, the world is finite. It's a finite event. And after that, we can definitely postulate that it needs a beginning. It needs a cause. So, that's the philosophical reason why. Now, did the universe come from nothing? That's the second attempt at refuting this argument. Well, okay, the universe began to exist, but why does it need a cause? It could have come from nothing. And that may sound so absurd to you. It should. It should sound nonsensical. Because what comes from nothing? Nothing. We've known that all along. And yet, some of the most brilliant minds in physics today seem to believe that this may be a possible explanation. You're talking about, Lawrence Krauss, and you're talking about Sir Peter Atkins and Alexander Vilenkin and Steven Weinberg and Stephen Hawking. These guys have, some of them have published books on a universe from nothing. But you know what? I have an entire talk on that. We're not going to deal with all of the detail. I just want to give you the summary, okay? I want to give it to you from their mouth so that I'm not accused of building a straw man. Listen to it from the horse's mouth. And I don't mean disrespect to Sir Peter Atkins. I'm not calling him a horse. It's an expression of saying, look, I want you to hear it from him.
And it may be that our universe happens to be that happy chance of nothing transforming itself into what seems to be something that seems to persist.
Did you catch that? Nothing transforming itself. How does that happen? Who's doing the transforming? Transforming is an action verb. To transform is an action verb. So what's the subject? What subject is doing the transforming if nothing exists? How can nothing transform itself? There is no it to do the transforming. It's ludicrous. But well, okay, you might argue these guys are brilliant. They must have some good evidence. And I don't usually quote Hume, by the way, because he was a pretty militant skeptic. But I agree with him on something. Here's what I agree with Hume on. He says that a wise man proportions his belief to the evidence. You know what? He's 100% right. There, I will not debate Hume on that. A wise man proportions his belief to the evidence. So we should ask Sir Peter Atkins, what evidence does he have that the universe came from nothing? I mean, that's a big claim to make. I'm sure you must have some really good reasons to postulate such a nonsensical response. Well, I'll let him respond to you regarding the evidence.
Science cannot yet do, and one day I think it will have to turn to doing, is thinking about how a universe can come into existence without intervention, from absolutely nothing, without a creator. And that's going to be really tough for science.
It's going to be really tough for science. Yeah, I think so. I'd rather say it's going to be kind of impossible for science. But there you have it. What science cannot yet do, and one day I guess it's going to have to try to do, is come up with some evidence, come up with some explanations, come up with some kind of paradigm in which we can explain how nothing becomes everything. And he's not alone. Look, I can quote every one of those guys that postulate this nonsensical idea that the universe came from nothing. And at the end of the day, every one of them will tell you there's no evidence. Listen to Alexander Vilenkin, who's another one who proposes these ideas. Listen to his response to the question, what evidence do you have? And remember, David Hume was right. A wise man proportions his belief to the evidence. Here we go.
Of course, if you ask, is there evidence that the universe began by the spontaneous nucleation out of nothing, I don't think we can produce any evidence for that.
There you have it. I don't think we can produce any evidence for that. Okay, so why are we writing books and selling books about how the universe came from nothing? You see, the argument that the universe had a beginning, and because it has a beginning, it needs a cause, is still alive and well. These counter arguments are weak at best. At best, they're weak. But they're not. They're in no way devastating to any of the arguments we're going to present today. As a matter of fact, I'm into quoting people today that I don't normally quote. Let me quote Darwin. Let me quote Charles Darwin on this issue. Listen to what Darwin says. The impossibility of conceiving that this grand and wondrous universe with our conscious selves arose through chance seems to me the chief argument for the existence of God. That he wrote that in 1873. He says, you know what? When I look at the universe, it's hard to believe that there is no God. It seems to me that the fact that we are conscious beings in a grand and wondrous universe is a really strong argument for the existence of God. Now, that argument is powerful. In order to negate the argument for God's existence, if God does not exist, what are we saying? Well, everything came from nothing? That's not a good answer. Or the universe is an effect without a cause? That would be a first. Can you name one effect without a cause in our universe? No, no one can. The law of causality is rigorous, and the law of causality is very strict. It demands that every effect has a cause. If we postulate that there is no God, we're postulating that motion was not set in motion. All of which is nonsense. So remember that argument, the cosmological argument. Everything that begins to exist requires a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Let's go on to the second argument, the axiological argument, the argument from morality. Here's how that goes. Premise one, if God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. However, objective moral values do exist. Therefore, God exists. This is a legitimate, logical, reasonable syllogism that presents an argument that must be dealt with. Because if the premises are true, then the conclusion has to follow. It's again in the form of a deductive argument. So let's take this into account. How do people deal with this argument? Well, the most common response I get to this argument is, well, are you saying that just because I'm an atheist, I can't live a moral life? No, I'm not saying that. As a matter of fact, I know atheists that live more morally than some of the Christians I know. We're not talking about how you can live your life. We're talking about where do objective moral laws come from. If there is no God, then there can be no objective moral laws. However, we would all agree that in our universe, some things are objectively good and some things are objectively bad, irregardless of anyone's opinion of it. It's hard to deny that that's a fact. So when you deal with this argument, here's what we need to keep in mind. The argument also follows the principle of causality. It really does. But moral laws are different than natural laws, no doubt. Moral laws don't describe what is. They prescribe what ought to be. This is critically important. Natural laws are descriptive. They describe the way the universe works. Description. But moral laws are not based on observation. They're not based on describing the way people interact. No, they are, instead of being descriptive, they are prescriptive. Moral laws tell you how you ought to be. Big difference. They're not simply a description of the way men behave, because as a matter of fact, men tend to be very immoral in their behavior. They're not known by observing what men do. If moral laws came from man's behavior, imagine what that would be like. From observing the way we interact. If they were, our idea of morality would surely be very different than it is today. Instead, they tell us what men ought to do, whether they are doing it or not. And that's what makes this a very powerful argument. You can't explain it by anything that happens in the universe. And it can't be reduced to things that men do in the universe. In other words, any moral ought comes from beyond the natural universe. The source of these moral oughts must be transcendent. It transcends the natural order. It requires a transcendent cause. Now that may sound really heavy philosophically for you. Let me break it down a little bit into a language that I think anybody can understand. In an atheist world, man is the ultimate authority. If there is no God, just think about it for a minute. If there is no God, who is the highest authority on this planet? Man is. Humans are. Because of all the living things on the planet, we are the most advanced, the most developed, and the only ones that really can express morality and can understand and are conscious of the world we live in and the relationships we entertain. So if God does not exist, there is no higher authority than man. And if it is man who postulates what is right and what is wrong, then it is not based on the behavior itself. It's based on the subject, the man proposing it. So all moral laws become subjective. They're a matter of opinion. What makes your law better than my law? Because we're both equally in a level field of authority as human beings. In an atheist world, there is no absolute moral standard to which man must adhere. There is none. And if there is, it becomes forced on people and not something that is understood to be part of the universe we live in. Only in a theistic world does morality and justice make sense. Only in a world where there is a God can we say that there is a law that everyone ought to obey. You can't get that from nature. It has to come from a supernatural, a transcendent source, and that is God. It is well known that you cannot get an ought from an is. You observe nature and you cannot get a prescription of what ought to be done. You can only describe what is. So if there is objective moral values, which we would agree there are, it is wrong for everyone, everywhere, at any time in history to torture small babies for fun. That's just one example of things that are objectively wrong. Rape, murder, child molesting, all of these things we admit, they are objectively wrong. They're not wrong just because you think they're wrong, just because it's your opinion they're wrong. If you had never been born, these things are still wrong. They're wrong for everybody, everywhere, at all times. So let's not go there about denying objective morality. It is undeniably so. And if it exists, it undeniably points to a lawgiver that transcends subjects in order to be objective. And so it's a strong argument that shows that God is a necessary being. Now, the third one is my favorite argument. It's the one I use the most. It's the argument from design. Again, simple deductive syllogism where if the premises are true, the conclusion has to follow. Here's the argument. All designs imply a designer. Premise 1. Premise 2. The universe has a great design. Conclusion, therefore the universe must have a great designer. It is simple deductive logic. And how do we begin to attack an argument as strong as this? All designs imply a designer. That's just common sense. It's what Paley said. If you find a watch in the beach, would anyone doubt that there's a watchmaker? Would anyone doubt it? No. A watch is not something that happens naturally. It has to have a designer. Look at the building you're in right now as you're watching this. Would anyone argue that that building is the result of an explosion at a Home Depot? Of course not. Someone designed the lighting, the plumbing, the everything, the colors, the textures, the flooring, the ceiling, the structure, the foundation. Wherever there is design, there is a designer. The second premise is equally strong. The universe has a great design. I don't care what you look at, whether you look at subatomic particles, you find incredible design, or whether you look at the entire universe, you find incredible design. And so everything that science discovers today, what does it reveal? Everything reveals incredibly complex levels of structure, incredibly complex levels of organization, incredibly complex levels of purpose. And complexity at that level where structure, organization, and purpose cannot be the result of unguided chance, of events that randomly happen. It cannot be. It speaks of a designer. Let me give you some arguments. Let me give you some evidence that shows that there's design in the universe. And trust me, this segment of our talk could last forever. We could spend the rest of our lives arguing and showing you evidences, one after another, after another, after another, after another, that point to a designer. Let's look at some of the examples of God's incredible design. Some of the very obvious examples. Our atmosphere. Is our atmosphere the result of unguided processes? Just the happy chance that after that Big Bang explosion, somehow this rock that we live in was able to trap all of the elements that we need in the proper balance and measures for there to be life on Earth. The atmosphere consists of 20% oxygen, 79% nitrogen, 0.03% carbon dioxide, 0.04% water, and 0.03 is a combination of various other elements. And so that is required for life. Any variation, however slight, in any of the components and the measurements of the oxygen or the nitrogen or the carbon dioxide or the water or all the other elements in our ozone layer, in our atmosphere, any variation, and there would be no life on Earth. So does that look to you like something that happened by chance? Or does it look like something that happened by design? Especially when you consider that the rest of the universe is primarily hydrogen and helium. The rest of the known universe to us consists primarily of hydrogen and helium. And yet in this rock, for some unknown reason, we have this mixture with amazing precision that allows for there to be biological life. That doesn't sound like chance to me. That sounds like this place was designed by a designer with the specific purpose for it to be inhabited by man. That's what it points to. Okay, here's another example of God's incredible design. Consider the atom. The atom is the fundamental particle of everything that exists. The Greek word atomos means invisible. It's the smallest particle of an element, and itself is consistent of numerous parts. And an atom tends to be 1 to 5 angstrom long. That's a very small size. That's a bunch of zeros after that decimal point. It's so small, it's called invisible. And yet, something so fundamental to our universe, something so tiny, at such an incredibly small scale, shows design. You will find a nucleus in the atom with protons and neutrons, and you will find a cloud of electrons orbiting that nucleus. Does that look like something that happened by chance? Or does that look designed? How do we get order? And by the way, the relationship of the protons to the neutrons and to the electrons, all of that is governed by very strict atomic laws. There is order, structure, purpose in the way these atoms are designed. They are definitely designed. Let me give you another example. One of the most common elements in our planet is water. Water is just, there's nothing more common than water on our planet. It just is. And so, what design do we see in water? Well, in a water molecule, you have an oxygen atom and you have 2 hydrogen atoms. And interestingly, the oxygen atom has 6 electrons orbiting around the nucleus in the outer layer and an inner layer with 2 electrons. What makes that interesting is that hydrogen atoms attach to the oxygen atom by providing their only electron. The only electron they have that circulates their nucleus becomes one of those that circulate the nucleus of the oxygen atom. Now that may sound complex. It's not. It's very elemental chemistry. However, what you need to understand is that there's an atomic law that says that an element becomes stable when it has a balance of 8 electrons rotating on its outer shell. So the oxygen atom is not as stable as it can be. In order to be strong and stable, it needs a couple of extra electrons orbiting its outer shell. And guess what? There's enough hydrogen to go around so that 2 hydrogen atoms can attach to oxygen and make it stable. And it is so stable once this occurs, it is so stable that you have to pretty much heat it to an incredible heat in order to get it to change and to separate and stop being water. Incredibly stable. Now, does that look like something that happened by chance? Or is it something that looks designed? I don't know. I find it really hard in my mind to look at something so incredibly structured and orderly that follows these incredibly stable atomic laws and say, you know what, that happened by chance. That, that explosion at the beginning, man, wow, it created all these nucleuses with neutrons and protons and clouds of electrons, and it did it in such a way where, hydrogen and oxygen can combine and form water. And guess what? We have a lot of water on this earth. A lot of water on the surface of this earth. We're not even going to go where the water came from, because that's another amazing thing. But we'll just keep it here. Now, let me give you another example of design. Incredible design. Our human body has a minimum of 100 trillion cells. Now, it depends what biology book you look at or anatomy book you look at. That number varies because it's an estimate. I've seen numbers as high as 700 trillion cells in the human body. But let's go with the smallest number, 100 trillion cells in our bodies. That's a number that's so big we can't even begin to imagine anything that's 100 trillion, that has a quantity of 100 trillion. And each one of those cells has 46 chromosomes. And those chromosomes all have DNA, the elemental building blocks of life. And so DNA, which is the organizing program that determines each characteristic of an individual, from his hair, his eyes, his height, his color of skin, and our entire design of our entire metabolism and our entire organism and our entire anatomy, everything is in there, in that information in DNA, in every single cell, times 100 trillion cells. Each DNA molecule has the same amount of information as an encyclopedia volume. Think about that. That you're talking about, we have more information in our bodies than all the libraries of the world combined. Every one of us does. So, does that look like something that happened by chance or by design? Information by chance? Good luck with that one. Give me some random chance event that produces information. No, let me make it easier. Give me a natural process that produces information. Doesn't exist. Information comes from minds. If there's information in the natural world, that is evidence that there is an intelligent designer behind it. Let me show you a video. This is from a video called Unlocking the Mysteries of Life. And it's a short clip that shows you what happens inside the cell, how that DNA is used to manufacture proteins. It's an incredible process. And trust me, what you're going to watch is amazing, and it is overly simplified. Overly simplified, because what you're watching is actually a lot more complex than what you're going to see. But this just gives you a general idea of how incredible the design is. Watch this video.
In the years since Kenyon's rejection of chemical evolution, science has revealed the details of an entire system of information processing that bears the hallmarks of intelligent design. With computer animation, we can enter the cell to view this remarkable system at work. After entering the heart of the cell, we see the tightly wound strands of DNA, storehouses for the instructions necessary to build every protein in an organism. In a process known as transcription, a molecular machine first unwinds a section of the DNA helix to expose the genetic instructions needed to assemble a specific protein molecule. Another machine then copies these instructions to form a molecule known as messenger RNA. When transcription is complete, the slender RNA strand carries the genetic information through the nuclear pore complex, the gatekeeper for traffic in and out of the cell nucleus. The messenger RNA strand is directed to a two-part molecular factory called a ribosome. After attaching itself securely, the process of translation begins. Inside the ribosome, a molecular assembly line builds a specifically sequenced chain of amino acids. These amino acids are transported from other parts of the cell and then linked into chains often hundreds of units long. Their sequential arrangement determines the type of protein manufactured. When the chain is finished, it is moved from the ribosome to a barrel-shaped machine that helps fold it into the precise shape critical to its function. After the chain is folded into a protein, it is then released and shepherded by another molecular machine to the exact location where it is needed.
This is absolutely mind-boggling to perceive at this scale of size such a finely tuned apparatus, a device that bears the marks of intelligent design and manufacture. And we have the details of an immensely complex molecular realm of genetic information processing. And it's exactly this new realm of molecular genetics where we see the most compelling evidence of design on the Earth.
Amen. Absolutely. This is where we find the most incredible evidence of design. Does that look like something that happened by chance? Or does that look like something that happened by design? Even atheists at some point admit that there is design. And that admission carries with it the weight of requiring a designer. Richard Dawkins is on video, on record, as stating that when you look at the details of molecular biology and biochemistry, you find some sort of signature of a designer. And he's not alone. Let me show you a TED Talk. This is a short little clip from a TED Talk where Stephen Larson, a neuroscientist from the University of California, a brilliant young scientist who's also an atheist. He's got engineering training. He's a brilliant guy. I want you to hear him describe the level of design that we find even in a simple bacteria, so that you can hear from someone that is not a believer tell you, look, we can't deny that there's design there. There absolutely is design there. Watch this short clip from a TED Talk. I think this speaks volumes because it's a hostile witness. Someone who, by not believing in God, has nothing to gain by postulating the fact that there is design, even at the molecular level. Watch this video clip.
As science continues to reveal how life works, we find again and again that the magic that seems to distinguish between things that are alive and things that are not are actually created by complex, interacting molecular machines. These microscopic machines are as precise and intricate as a mechanical watch, but instead of being run on gears and springs, are powered by the fundamental rules of physics and chemistry. Our understanding of the precise coiling and uncoiling of the DNA molecule, or the way that one molecule can literally walk almost robotically along the tightrope of another molecule, continue to show us again and again this molecular clockwork is real and pervasive. Now, what's most unsettling to me about this is that we didn't build these machines. As someone originally trained as an engineer, I gotta be honest with you, I kind of hate this. I mean, as the most clever species on the planet, we kind of like to think of ourselves as the builders of the most sophisticated technology in the entire universe, right? I mean, we invented written language and the printing press. We cured polio and sent a man to the moon. I mean, heck, we even took savage beasts and turned them into kittens and then built a global communications network to share pictures of them. I mean, that's pretty impressive. And yet, when I look through a microscope at a humble bacterium, who, by the way, his ancestors were on the planet a billion years ago, billions of years ago, I still wonder how it really works. Because the mechanical watch that is life is not like any watch we've ever built. It is biological gears and springs, but they fill rooms and buildings and cities of a vast microscopic landscape that's bustling with activity. I mean, on the one hand, it's extremely well organized, but on the other hand, the sheer scale of all of this unfamiliar, well-organized stuff that happens in there makes me feel like, I've stumbled onto an alternate landscape of technology that's built by an engineer 1,000,000 times smarter than me.
Did you catch that expression? Let me give it to you again, very briefly. Just the key that I want to highlight. He says, when I look through a microscope at a humble bacterium, I still wonder how it really works. Because the mechanical watch that is life is not like any watch we've ever built. It is biological gears and springs, but they fill rooms and buildings and cities of a vast microscopic landscape that's bustling with activity. On the one hand, it's extremely well organized, but on the other hand, the sheer scale of all this unfamiliar, well-organized stuff that happens in there, listen to what he says, makes me feel that I've stumbled onto an alternate landscape of technology that's built by an engineer 1,000,000 times smarter than me. There you have it. When someone like Stephen Larson tells you that the design he sees in a bacterium is something that must have been designed by an engineer 1,000,000 times smarter than him, the designer becomes necessary, or shall I say inevitable. If there's design, there has to be a designer. Now, as an atheist, where does he go with that? He goes where Richard Dawkins goes with it. It's probably aliens that did it. So then we're just talking about who is it, whether it's aliens or the God of the Bible, but there has to be a designer. Furthermore, Bill Gates says that human DNA is like a computer program, but far more advanced than any software we've ever created. So think about that. DNA by chance? I don't think so. As a matter of fact, I bet you didn't know this. Or maybe you did. But our cells, talk about computers. Listen to this clip and we'll talk about it for a second. This is powerful.
There are thousands or millions of interacting computers in every cell that communicate with one another. They read the information, they transfer information from one component to another component. There are many different operating systems involved. There are different programming languages involved with the various components that are within the cell. And all of them have the same components that any other computer would have.
biological computers, programming languages, software, hardware. Information science today is one of the most challenging and most incredible fields of science to go into, because they are finding how the cell engages in computer programming, computer software, computer functionality, and it's incredibly impressive. That's why Craig Venter, biotechnologist, biochemist, geneticist, who also with a team of scientists mapped the human genome, says that life is basically the result of an information process, a software process. Now, when was the last time software was developed by random chance? Think about that for a minute. If there is software, there's definitely an intelligent designer behind the software. He says this, he goes on to say, our genetic code is the software, and our cells are dynamically, constantly reading that genetic code. DNA is a code, it's information, and that information is read in the cells and transferred to other metabolisms in the cell to produce proteins, and all of these interactions and all of this connectivity, this obviously speaks of design. No doubt whatsoever. How could non-living material develop the hardware and the software known to be required by all living organisms? How do you explain this without a designer? You cannot. How do you explain this without a creator? You cannot. And how do you explain this without an intelligent personal designer? You cannot. It's impossible. So let me ask you a question. What's the probability of a simple cell evolving by undirected natural processes? There are far more intelligent scientists than myself and mathematicians that have spent a lot of time on this. And they start with not a cell, they start with a more humble approach about a protein. Okay? What are the odds of a modest protein being designed by chance? 1 in 10 to the 164th power. That's a 1 followed by 164 zeros. We don't even have a name for a number that size. It's only something we can theorize about. That's the chance of one protein, one modest protein being developed by chance. What happens when you try to go to the next level and build something living? The probability of life evolving from undirected processes is somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 in 10 to the 340 millionth power. Right, yeah, it's a joke. It's like, we don't even need to go there. Anything above 10 to the 60th or 70th power is considered impossible by scientists. Impossible. So life evolving from undirected processes is scientifically and mathematically and philosophically impossible. Impossible. I want to finish with the video. I want you to watch this because this is an illustration, an analogy of the probability of life evolving from undirected processes. And here's what we're looking for. Let's say that you have this very special grain of sand that you just love. It's really special to you. And you painted this grain of sand red. It's the only grain of sand in the universe that's red. But you lost it. What are the odds of you finding that grain of sand that you lost? Let's watch this video and it'll kind of give you a picture of the odds of life evolving by undirected processes.
Here we have one tiny grain of sand. It's been estimated that there are 1 million grains of sand in a half a cup. It would take 1 million half cups of sand to fill a swimming pool that's 6 feet deep and 30 feet in diameter. Now, if we took 1 billion of these pools of sand, we could fill Lake Tahoe in Nevada, which is about 22 miles long and 12 miles wide.
Think you could find that original grain of sand we started with? We're not done yet.
It would take about 1 billion Lake Tahoes to fill the volume of the Earth with sand. The probability of grabbing that original grain of sand out of the Earth filled with sand is 1 in 10 to the 30th power. It would take 100 million Earths to fill 1 sun with sand, and 1 trillion suns to fill our solar system, 10 trillion solar systems to fill 1 cubic light year, 100 trillion cubic light years to fill the volume of the Milky Way galaxy, and finally 10 billion Milky Way galaxies to fill the observable universe. Whew. That is a lot of sand.
The probability of now randomly picking our original grain of sand from the entire observable universe is 1 in 10 to the 96th power. Still a far cry from our protein being formed at 1 in 10 to the 164th power, and even less chance of life evolving from undirected natural processes at the probability of 1 in 10 to the 340 millionth power. Starting to get the idea?
Scientists generally consider anything with a probability of less than 1 part in 10 to the 70th power operationally impossible. And by the way, that calculation doesn't take into consideration the information that's stored in the cell, which directs the cell in all aspects of operation.
That estimate is solely the chance of chemicals combining to form something living.
Chance is obviously not a good explanation in the light of such incredible design. That's why the Word of God said that the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. Because all you have to do is look around you. Look at the world we live in. It began to exist. It must have a cause. There is objective morality. There has to be a lawmaker. There is incredible design in everything. There has to be a designer. And although these arguments do not establish the identity of that designer, it's the God of the Bible who is the designer, the creator, the lawgiver. There's incredible coherence and consonance between the God of the Bible as he is described and the universe we live in as we can observe it. So my challenge to you today is, if you don't believe in God, why? You would need to be able to come up with an explanation that is more reasonable than the ones we have just seen for an effect without a cause, objective morality without a lawgiver, design without a designer. It doesn't seem possible. Now, you can still choose not to believe in God, but you would hopefully understand that you're doing so because you simply don't want to believe in God. But the evidence is there. I encourage you to seek out the God of the Bible, the God of Christianity, because he has said very clearly that anyone who knocks on his door, he's going to open it. Anyone who calls on him, he will answer. If you truly seek him, you will find him. And like myself and other Christians, you won't need arguments to know that God exists, because you can directly experience God in your life. I know God exists the way I know I exist, because I know him. He's a part of everything I do in my life. I encourage you to think about it. I'm Dr. Juan Valdes with Reasons for Hope. God bless you.
If you enjoyed this content, please pray about making a tax-deductible donation at www.r4h.com/donate. Thank you in advance for partnering with this ministry.